Okay, so yesterday I got my big wood delivery in. Here's my stack of 3/4 inch plywood. Over there's a pile of 1/2 inch plywood. And then over there is the 1/4 inch plywood. And while I was waiting for the delivery, I made these 2 support trestles. And all of this is in preparation for building this first project that I'm going to do with the plywood. Is this mobile Outfeed assembly table, which will make all my subsequent projects a lot easier to do. There's the basic drawings, and here is the cut list that I made. That's page 1, and then there's 2, and then there's 3. That's the cut list for the Outfeed assembly table. So my first order of business today, after getting a few things set up, is to wrestle a piece of the 3/4 inch plywood up onto the table saw, and then get rid of the factory edges and square everything up and start. Okay, we're all set up, so it's time to start cutting some wood. So far you've seen me make a lot of cuts with little to nothing in the way of explanation about what it is I'm doing. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about what it is I am doing. What I've been involved in doing so far is cutting out the major structural components for this Outfeed assembly table. I'm using a circular saw to make the cuts, because it's a lot easier to break down big sheets of plywood using a circular saw than it is using the table saw. Now, a table saw would be a lot more accurate and a lot more repeatable more quickly than the circular saw, because there's a lot of setup involved, which I'm going to show you now. The problem with using the table saw is it's really hard to handle a big sheet of plywood on the circular saw, or on the table saw rather, and my table saw is not really set up to handle big sheets of plywood anyway. What I would really need to handle big sheets of plywood on the table saw is more surface area to support the big sheets of plywood. In this area here, as the wood is coming off the blade after the cut is being made, and even on the other side, before the blade, if I had additional support, it would be easier or more feasible to cut larger pieces of plywood on the table saw. But I don't have that. Now, this project I'm building, one of the reasons why I'm building it is to provide some more of that surface area. Even so, I will still probably tend to take and break down whole sheets of plywood using the circular saw, because it's still easier and more accurate to do that, albeit more tedious and slowly. So now I'm going to show you how I go about setting up for making a cut. I've cut this piece of wood 44 inches long because I need the next 3 pieces I cut need to be 44 inches long, and they each need to be 13 inches wide. So I'm going to show you exactly what I have to do to set up to make a perfectly parallel 13-inch wide piece of plywood. So I could use the tape measure, but it's a little more accurate to use this. This is a T-square. I wish it was a little longer, but it is what it is, and it works well for what it is. So, given my eyesight, it helps me to take off my glasses. I wish it wasn't so, but that's one of the realities of crappy vision and getting older. And then just to double check, I go on the other side and make the same thing. I've already taken steps to ensure that this is perfectly straight and that these corners here and that corner there are perfectly 90 degrees to each other. Now I'm going to put on this guide rail. And the guide rail always covers the piece of wood you want to keep. Because if I were to do it this way, then I would have to compensate for the width of the blade. If I do it this way, I don't have to compensate for the width of the blade. It's one less thing for me to think about. It's one less thing for me to keep straight in my head and hopefully not screw up. Now these guide rails have 2 strips of non-skid material on the bottom because theoretically you're supposed to be able to use these guide rails without clamping them down. I've never had any success doing that. It's probably my poor technique, but I prefer to clamp each cut down. Takes longer, makes it more tedious, but I'm kind of a belts and suspenders kind of guy anyway, so I'm more than happy to take the time and to assure that it's going to be right. I find that the more steps I take to ensure the perfection of the cut, the better off I am, because inevitably inaccuracies will creep into a project, but I find that if I take as many steps as possible to keep the tolerances really, really tight, it helps keep those inaccuracies to a minimum. So after I roughly place this, I check with my square, and that's pretty good, that's not a problem. And what I've done is I figured out in order to make a 13-inch cut, which is going to be to this line here, I know that by setting my square for 5 3/4 of an inch, that will get me to the 13. So it's another way of double checking. So that looks good there. Then I go over here and do it, and that helps me assure that this cut is going to be perfectly parallel to this edge. Again, theoretically, you shouldn't have to go through all these steps, but now this was out just a little bit, maybe just a 32nd of an inch, but you know, again, if we try to keep the tolerances as tight as possible, we'll maintain as good of an accuracy as we possibly can throughout this whole project, which is ultimately what I want. Okay, so that's all set up. Now I know this cut is going to be perfectly parallel to this edge here. I'm just going to throw the tape measure on here real quick just to double check that yes, that is 13 inches. I'll tell you, I cannot measure often enough before I make a cut. You know, there's the old carpenter saying, measure twice, cut once. Well, for me, it's more like measure 3, 4, maybe even 5 times, and then hopefully cutting once. To provide some extra stability, I'm going to actually clamp this board down. It doesn't have to be too tight, I just want to keep it from shifting around. Again, more of this belts and suspenders type approach. Now I'll get my support trestles and put them in place. And here's my little shim blocks. I deliberately made the trestles shorter than they really needed to be because I figured I'm going to use these in different applications, and if I made them exactly as high as the table saw and the Outfeed table are, it would give me less versatility. So I'm willing to take the time to shim these things up a bit. And having the extra support just results in a better cut. I don't have to worry about trying to catch the cut off. You know, and you can see that the table saw isn't perfectly, the top of the table saw is not perfectly parallel with the floor, so there's some unevenness in the shimming I have to do, but that's okay. All right, so after all that, now I'm actually ready to make my cut. And what you've just seen here, this is what I had to do for every single cut that I make using that circular saw. It's tedious, it takes some time, but it ends up with really good results, and that's what counts. So here we go. And there it is. Really nice cut. I'll make 3 more boards and I'll be done with the basic structural components for this Outfeed assembly table.